President Trump and congressional leaders are racing against the deadline again and to avert next week's partial government shutdown and pushing disputes over the president's border wall and an array of legislation that touches on everything from Saudi Arabia to farming policy into the waning hours of the Republican domination of Congress. But the deepest impasse and the one with the greatest potential to prompt a year-end breakdown is Trump's demand for $5 billion for the wall on the United States southern border. The president has pressed for its inclusion in the final spending package before his party loses its House majority in January, and this is why there's a bit of an impasse. And obviously the Democratic leaders have refused to accept it, and so we have a standoff. I'll have more about that later. The US judge ordered the Justice and State Departments last week to reopen an inquiry into whether Hillary Clinton used a private email server. I don't know why they need an inquiry into that. I think half of America knows by now. While the Secretary of State, while she was Secretary of State, to deliberately evade public record laws and to answer whether the agencies acted in bad faith by not telling a court for months that they had asked in mid-2014 for the missing emails to be returned. Now, this order risks reopening bipartisan wounds, which is highly prevalent at the moment, and this has gone on for the last 2 years, and I expect the way it's at the rate they're going, it'll go on for another 2 years. It's about time it was wrapped up and dealt with. But in issuing the order last Thursday, the US District Judge, Mr. Lambert, said the spirit of Freedom of Information Act required it, and in a narrow but sharply worded 10-page opinion, Mr. Lambert wrote that despite the government's claimed presumption of transparency, faced with one of the gravest modern offences to government openness, the Obama administration's State and Justice Departments fell far short of the law's requirements in a lawsuit for documents. And he also added that despite President Trump's repeated campaign attacks against Clinton for not making her emails public, the current Justice Department made things worse by taking the position that agencies are not obliged to research or search for records not in the government's possession when a Freedom of Information request is made. Really? Agencies are not obliged to search for records not in the government's possession. Now you know why things take far too long. The transcript has been made available, or a partial transcript, of the final words uttered by Jamal Khashoggi after he was set upon by a Saudi hit squad at the country's consulate in Istanbul. Now, according to a source briefed on the investigation into the killing of the Washington Post columnist, the source had read a translated script of an audio recording of Khashoggi's painful last moments and said it was clear that the killing on October the 2nd was no botched rendition attempt, but the execution of a premeditated plan to murder the journalist. Now, during the course of the gruesome scene, the source described Mr. Khashoggi struggling against a group of people who were determined to kill him, where he says he can't breathe 3 times during the transcript, and the transcript notes also the sounds of Khashoggi's body being dismembered by a saw, as the alleged perpetrators are advised to listen to music to block out the sound. And according to the source, the transcript suggests that a series of phone calls were made, briefing them on the progress, and the Turkish officials believe the calls were made to senior figures in Riyadh. Yes, the Crown Prince, in my opinion. Now, following on from that, the US Senate today has voted to withdraw US military aid for Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen. Two of the countries I told you to listen out for, Israel being the other one, about 5 or 6 weeks ago. And to blame the kingdom's crown prince for the murder of the journalist. Members of the Donald Trump party joined Democrats today by voting 56-41 to rebuke the long-time US ally over the reporter Jamal Khashoggi's death. Now, Mr. Trump has vowed to veto the largely symbolic measure and is unlikely to pass the House of Representatives. But experts say Yemen is experiencing the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and the non-binding War Powers Resolution also calls on Saudi Arabia to moderate its increasingly erratic foreign policy. Yes, well, now Daddy's finally been laid to rest. That should get a bit easier. The US chose to cease refuelling Saudi warplanes last month, and today's resolution, if it were passed into law, would prohibit that practice from resuming. This has the potential to become the next item that's going to be played out across the Portal People screens. There will be ramifications. And former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie said that President Donald Trump's team should be concerned about the indictment at the time against Michael Cohen because the language used in it suggests that federal prosecutors have further corroborating evidence. Now, prosecutors in New York last Friday indicated that Trump breached campaign finance laws by instructing Cohen, his former attorney, to illegally pay off 2 women who had claimed they had affairs with him, which was threatening the 2016 campaign. On Sunday, Christie told ABC This Week that the language prosecutors used in the sentencing memo sounded very definitive, which would mean they likely have more than just one witness. Now, Cohen later in the week was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in jail. I don't think we've heard the last of that. Having increased the levy on gas or petrol, whichever way you choose to call it, which was imposed on France and many other countries that the IMF threatened, I think it's time for all countries to tell the IMF and the defunct UN to piss off, quite frankly. They are both a failed and bankrupt programme. We don't need either for each country to progress. But President Emmanuel Macron, following the demonstrations and protests, admitted he'd lacked sensitivity for the concerns of regular people and promised a raft of new spending as he sought to draw a line under the month-long yellow vest crisis, which has gone through France and is now thankfully going into other countries, Sweden amongst them. And in a statement aired on Monday night on French television, he urged companies to pay their workers a year-end bonus that won't be taxed, ended levies on overtime, and indicated the government would fund a €100 a month, which is $114, increase in the minimum wage, and also abolished a controversial tax on pensions below €2,000 a month. He went on to say, I feel in many ways that the anger of the Yellow Vests is justified, and France is facing a state of social and economic emergency, he added. So the yellow vests got the way. That's what we've been saying on THI for a long time. It's the people that have the power, not them. It's not Macron. This is where THI excels and getting people to understand all the ills of the world have got nothing to do with governments. It's not to do with Trump, it's not to do with May, it's not to do with Macron or Merkel or any other Prime Minister or President. They're so far down the chain, it's not even funny. These are all imposed political ideologies and reasonings that they are there to pass on. Now, I'm not suggesting that politicians are any way good, because some of them clearly are not. In fact, most of them aren't. But blaming the government is not the way forward. Blaming the system. Once people start blaming the system, then people are really getting what's going on. Macron is the puppet that has been forced to back down. Like I said, people power. But Macron was forced into that programme of putting levies on petrol or gas by the IMF. This is what's going on. Facing the prospect of a humiliating defeat, Prime Minister Theresa May said on Monday she would seek to postpone a parliamentary vote on her proposal for Britain's departure from the European Union. And this threw the process into disarray and highlighted her tenuous hold on power. Now, Parliament in Britain had been scheduled to vote on Tuesday on the agreement that Mrs May reached with the bloc for Britain's withdrawal, more commonly known as Brexit. And but after weeks of bitter criticism and days of parliamentary debate, had left no doubt that the plan would be soundly rejected by lawmakers, due in large part to objections over plans to dealing with the Irish border, that pro-Brexit lawmakers say that could potentially leave the United Kingdom tied to some of the bloc's rules indefinitely. Now, Mrs May survived the vote of no confidence since that piece. But the Brexit, as I said, when the vote was announced, and we were live on air at the time in Cosmic Voice, it'll just roll on. It's all becoming a distraction game. Beijing has adopted a harsh new tone against Canada this week, summoning the country's ambassador to China and threatening serious consequences if Ottawa does not release immediately Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei chief financial officer. The warning issued by the Chinese Foreign Ministry late last Saturday marks a shift in response from China, and initially China faulted both Canada and the United States for the arrest of Ms. Meng, who is the daughter of the founder of the company and a former army engineer who built his company into China's largest private enterprise. And it now appears China is setting its sights on Canada only. No surprise. And Miss Meng's arrest caused shockwaves in a country that sees that company as a flag bearer for Chinese economic aspirations, and the Foreign Ministry warning was followed by coordinated commentaries from the People's Daily and Xinhua News, and two of the central organs of China's state press. Canada will pay a heavy price if it does not recognise and accept Chinese demands, saying no one should underestimate China's confidence, will and strength. Now, the Canadian officials arrested Ms. Meng at the request of the United States, which has sought to extradite her over accusations she committed fraud in misleading an investigation into the sale of US technology to Iran. You always get Iran in something. China summons the US Ambassador Terry Branstad to meet with the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Li Yucheng and accused Washington of being unreasonable. On it goes. Report highlighting the poverty, which is indicative to all Western nations currently, as part of the Soros, UN, Rothschilds, Chinese elders plan to move all the funds and money to the east and essentially bankrupt Europe and America, plus Canada. And more than 500,000 British workers have been swept into working poverty over the past 5 years. And this is according to a report that shows the number of people with a job but living below the breadline has risen faster than employment, a common theme. And the latest sign of the link between entering work and making ends meet has become increasingly frayed in Britain, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation said the number of workers in poverty hit 4 million last year. That's people working. Meaning about 1 in 8 in the economy are now classed as working poor. Nearly all of the increase comes as growing numbers of working parents find it harder to earn enough money to pay for food, clothing and accommodation due to weak wage growth. Also, an erosion of welfare support and tax credits and the rising cost of living. 500,000 more children have become trapped in poverty over the last 5 years as a direct consequence, reaching 4.1 million at the end of last year. It means that in a typical classroom of 30 children, 9 would come from a household in poverty, 1 in 3. And the chief executive of the foundation said we are seeing a rising tide of child poverty as more parents are unable to make ends meet, and this despite working. This is unacceptable, and the charity defines the poverty line as being when households earn less than 60% of the median income, which is adjusted for size and type of household. Now, the average median income for UK households after housing costs was £425 a week, which is roughly $600, and it called on the government to end its 4-year freeze on benefits, which began in 2016, which was a year earlier than planned, so they can collect more money. Saying it would help lift 200,000 people out of poverty and give 14 million people on low incomes an extra £270, which is about $330 on average in the year 2020-21. Another sign of the times, with the programmes that they implemented, suddenly makes other groups become minorities. But universities in Britain this week are now setting targets to recruit more white male students. This is in Britain. After low numbers meant that white males are now classed as a minority group in Britain. Essex and Aston universities have become Britain's first non-elite institutions to write the target into their official recruitment plans, putting white males on a par with black students and women engineers. White British students are in a minority at roughly 1 in 10 institutions, and meanwhile on certain courses such as pharmacy, business and some science degrees, more than 7 in 10 students is from an ethnic minority. On 2016-17, 27% of the UK undergraduate intake were white males, down from 30% 10 years ago. A federal judge on Tuesday ordered adult film star Stormy Daniels, slapper, to pay President Trump more than $293,000 in legal fees amid their ongoing legal battles. The US District Judge James Otero ordered Daniels, whose real name is Stephanie Clifford, to pay the fees in her defamation case against Trump, which Otero dismissed in October. The slapper got slapped. Oh dear. Another sign of the times. This is a common thing, but I wanted to pull it out because of the sheer volume of money involved. A Harris County, Texas grand jury this week indicted a former Houston's First Baptist Church minister for allegedly stealing more than $800,000 from the church. Really? Now, the Jarrell G. Altick, who is 40, allegedly embezzled the money during a 6-year period, which is roughly $120,000 a year. That ended in November of 2017, according to the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Now, prosecutors say Altick allegedly spent the stolen funds on overseas trips with his family, groceries, and to pay for his doctorate in divinity. Really? From Lancaster Bible College. And they added that he stole the money in numbers of ways, including forged payments, authorizations. And Mr. Altick surrendered to authorities on Tuesday. How is it that the church can miss $125,000 a year? How much money does that church really have? Is it the church's role to collect money when their communities are suffering, particularly in Houston? Why isn't the church just giving money out to the people? Isn't that what it's supposed to be about? And yet this particular church can just miss $125,000 a year from its funds and not notice. Strasbourg, there was a shooting this week, and like all Middle Eastern terrorists, they all have the habit of two things. They all say Allahu Akbar, and they also own up to what they've done. Strange people, them. Nobody else does, do they? But this gunman yelled Allahu Akbar, God is greatest, in Arabic, and he opened fire on people at a Christmas market. France's anti-terror prosecutors told reporters. And Remy Heights said 2 people were killed, which is now 3, and 1 left brain dead, which I'm assuming that was the 3rd person in the eastern French city. 12 were wounded, 6 seriously. Now, the main suspect, named by local media as Sharif Shekat, is known to authorities as someone who was radicalised in prison. Really? And the 29-year-old was armed with a gun and a knife and escaped the area in a taxi. The attacker boasted to the taxi driver, who has spoken to the police, that he killed 10 people and said he'd been injured in a firefight with soldiers. I don't know how people listen to this drivel. I really don't. Why is it only Middle Eastern terrorists that admit to what they've done? There's a bomb goes off and the Taliban or the Al-Qaeda or ISIS, they all go, it was me. Who else does that? You know, the fact that this guy, Sharif Shekat, works for Mossad, oops, and the incident was in France, oops again, should tell you all you need to know. Final news piece, so we go into some rapid fire Q&A. Californians, fresh from voting from Feinstein and Pelosi, La La Land. May or may not like this particular news that came out this week, and perhaps they'll all be typing on it, OMG, oh my god. But texting in California may soon come with an extra fee on their mobile phone bills. State regulators are weighing a tax on text messaging to help fund a program that makes phone service available to low-income residents. A texting surcharge could help sustain the public purpose program budget, which has risen to $998 million in 2017 from $670 million in 2011. And this is according to a report from the California Public Utilities Commission, no doubt linked to the Rothschilds Group recently. And revenue from the telecom industry that funds the program has declined to $11.3 billion last year from $16.5 billion in 2011. Personally, I would put a tax on politicians in La La Land on breathing and double it for speaking. Then that will pay that stupid bill. It's almost as idiotic as the jizz woman in Texas. You know, these are the people that are deciding, or supposed to be deciding, our future. What about all the kiddie fiddlers and fake talent people down Hollywood Boulevard? How about taking some money off them, as they clearly have far too much to waste on bum implants and lip implants and everything else that's fake. You know, I think the California people have suffered enough stupidity over the last 4 years of trying to empty them out of their own state. I think it's time we emptied out all of the politicians. Utter clowns.